This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 27 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're tackling a very important issue. Are all Aussies tanned and tall? Well, I can, spoiler alert, tell you the answer straight away. No, we are not. But what we will talk about today is a lot about stereotypes and quite a lot about the stereotypical Australian and how Aussies are perceived around the world. But not just Aussies, and we'll talk about how stereotypes are hopefully dispelled the more you travel. It's an interesting topic to me. Obviously, I was born in Australia and I've spent most of my life here, apart from sort of 5.5 years when I lived overseas. And I like some of the sort of stereotypical ideas that we have about Australians. I like that we're meant to be friendly and fairly laid back about life. I like that we're perceived that we travel a lot. You know, there's only, I think we're up to 22 million of us now, but when you travel the world, you seem to find Australians in all corners of the globe. And because of some of our historical attitudes to work and leave from work, we often travel for quite some time. We're not bound by that like American work ethic where we can only do short trips, or the Japanese similar idea that, you know, you've got to kind of cram everything into 4 or 5 days and quickly get back to work. And I know it's always interesting that people ask about long service leave. That's a historically wonderful thing that we have in Australia. It started back when most Australians had moved here by boat from Europe, and to be able to get back to visit their family who they'd left behind, they needed, you know, enough time to get back on the boat trip, stay a little while, and return again on a boat. And that's where this long service leave idea came in. These days, I think typically you need to work somewhere between 7 and 10 years, and you probably get 3 months off. Being self-employed, I don't get long service leave, but I try to create my own, I suppose. But back when I was a child and my family were able to spend 6 months travelling in a camper van around Europe, that was courtesy of my father being able to take 6 months of paid leave because of his long service at the bank he worked for. So some of these things, and we typically have at least 4 weeks annual leave from a job a year. So we have this attitude that we love to travel a lot. And I think that's a wonderful part of being Australian. There's some sort of stereotypical things that I don't love so much. And I think as a consequence of being isolated and far away from the rest of the world, sometimes we can be a bit closed-minded. So, which kind of is the opposite of having travelled a lot, being open-minded. But in any case, I think that I know, many, many hundreds of Australians, and none of them really actually reach this stereotype properly, because stereotypes are just, a conglomeration of different ideas. But we're going to talk a lot more about that today. And our first guest today, guests, in fact, Katie and Jeremy Kloberdanz of the Life Bohemian. So I love their story of the stereotypical Australian who they met on their travels. Do you think there's a stereotypical Australian?
I do. And only because I feel like I have met one, and his name was Amos, and he was tall and tan and like really good looking, and he like called everyone mate, and he was wearing like Ugg boots, and it was like 65 degrees outside, but he thought it was so cold, and I was like, this is like the most perfect human I've ever met, because he's everything that I want Australians to be. There he is.
He was amazing. He was, yeah. I mean, he could have played in like state of origin rugby type of thing. He looked like a rugby player, big, really fit, and the nicest guy in the world. I think that's the biggest stereotype about Australians for us Americans, is we think Australians are just really friendly and really fun loving and kind of outgoing. So a bit like us, a little bit loud, but in a little bit nicer way than the typical American is.
And we think you all surf.
No, I totally can't surf. No skill at all in that area. But I'd like to think that I'm friendly.
Yeah. But yeah, that's what we think. We think everyone surfs and everyone's tan and everyone is just very, very nice.
Oh, well, I'm happy to hear that.
I don't know if this is kind of a little side note, but we have these commercials for, is it Foster's?
Yes.
Well, it's Foster's Beer and it's Outback Steakhouse.
Yes. So we have a restaurant called Outback Steakhouse. And I mean, you'll have to YouTube like an Outback Steakhouse commercial. I mean, there are kangaroos and boomerangs and like shrimp on the Barbie. And I'm like, I never heard a single Australian ever say that.
Literally, we don't even use the word shrimp.
Yeah,
exactly. So Amanda, there's one where it like a truck or a ute, for you guys pulls up and a bunch of, kind of guys from the Outback all pile in the back and they're all twisted together. And it says yoga and the truck drives off and it says beer, and they slide a Foster's to each one of them and they say Foster's Australian for beer.
That's terrible.
It's so over the top. But we actually stayed with some friends in Australia, and I was telling them about it. So we YouTubed the videos for, I don't know, probably 3 hours straight.
Oh, they're so funny. They're hysterical.
I would definitely have to have a look. That's amazing. But yeah, we don't drink Foster's beer. We just send that offshore because nobody likes it here.
Oh, that's even better. We'll send you. Jeremy has your email. I'll email you some of the videos so you can see them.
Please.
They're really, really funny.
That's amazing. I'm really glad that you have only this positive image of Australians, at least, because sometimes overseas, I think Aussies can be not that great. Actually, there's a bit must be coming out on this week's episode about Australians in Japan, in the ski fields in Japan, and being like all drunk and disrespectful, and
no.
Yeah, especially in Japan, really stresses me. Yeah, and like in places like Bali, where there's like thousands and thousands and thousands of Australians, and so we're not always as good as we should be. But at least you have a good idea of us.
Yeah. From one country who is known to be disrespectful to another.
Yes, fair point.
I have never met anything but like wonderful, wonderful Australians.
Oh, well, that's so lovely to hear. Thank you. I'm really pleased to hear that Jeremy and Katie have met so many wonderful Australians on their travels, and I hope that continues. I'm sure it will. Fingers crossed. Now, my next guest is Tom Parson, who you might remember as the Lego backpacker. Tom's actually from New Zealand, and New Zealand and Australia have that interesting relationship where we're extremely similar in many ways, but we do like to make jokes about each other. But I'm not going to make any of those jokes because Tom's a great guy. Now, he's going to talk to us a lot about the kind of stereotypes you meet when you're backpacking. It's a really common thing for Australians and New Zealanders to spend, an extended trip in Europe, as Tom will discuss, sort of between their late teens and mid-20s. And some of these people kind of meet a more positive stereotype and some a more negative stereotype. But Tom's all out to correct these people who assume bad things because of the stereotypes that they've heard or come across.
I've been going through most of Europe for the last 7 months, and it's quite interesting. Obviously, with the type, I've been doing it as pretty much as a budget backpacker, so I've been staying in hostels and couch surfing and things like that. And you meet so many different people from so many different sides of the world. I mean, particularly you meet a lot of Australians when you're traveling through Europe, particularly in there's like a main route that most of them do. So they all do like Paris, they do Berlin, they do Prague, etc. But I mean, I remember I was in Spain sitting down at a table, and at the table we had 3 Germans, 4 American guys from Ohio, a couple of Australian guys and everything. And there's different stereotypes that you meet whilst you're traveling, particularly in the backpacking scene, because most of them are quite young. So they're usually on their gap year between high school and university, so about 19, 20 years old, or you get the others that have just graduated and want to take some time off, so they're about 23, 24. And with the stereotypes, I mean, there's different countries, and you know that the Germans are known for traveling quite a bit. The Australians are known for traveling quite a bit. But I mean, as an example, with the Australians, I've met a lot of them that like to travel a lot, and they want to go see all the cultures. They want to see the cathedrals, they want to see the museums, the art galleries, and do the free walking tours. And there's some places where I'd be hanging out with a few of them, and in the same hostel, you would have another group of Australians there, and they are solely there to party. So, I mean, there's different stereotypes. And I mean, I get a little bit annoyed when I'm traveling and stuff, because I've met a few people where they're just like, oh, I don't like people from this country, or I don't like people from that country. And sometimes I correct them. Sometimes I know it's not really worth it. But sometimes I correct them where I'm just like, well, remember that country's got a population of 25 million, or that populate, or this, or like, I mean, I've heard people say, I don't like Australians, or I don't like New Zealanders, or I mean, I've seen on hostel bookers that some hostels will say, I don't like, they don't want people over the age of 30 to stay at this hostel.
Oh,
so
no, that's terrible.
There's quite a few in Europe, and you have to keep an eye out for it, and they'll reject you at the door, even if you're 31 or something. And I mean,
really?
So you'll turn up, and yeah, they'll stop you because they want to have the younger groups there, because they'll usually have a bar connected to the hostel, and they get a lot of income from the bar.
Wow.
So, but they prefer to have party people there than other people. So it's quite interesting talking to people where they're with stereotypes and stuff, where they're saying, I don't like people from this country. I've been to a hostel where some of them are like, where was it? I remember there was one hostel where they said, oh, we normally don't accept people from New Zealand because they had a very bad incident with a group of young New Zealanders. I'll be like, remember, like, they're a different age group, they're from the X generation or something, but also they've been brought up in a different way. I mean, there's different stereotypes of different countries, but I firmly believe that with stereotypes, you can't label it with their countries. Nothing against New Zealanders. I've traveled all through New Zealand, and a lot of them are like, well, I don't like people from this country. And I'm like, well, you can't really say that, because remember, that country's got 200 million or 400 million or a billion people. I mean,
you can't judge everyone on the people you've met.
Yeah, but also I have to remind them, I'm like, remember too, that in New Zealand, from some countries, it's very expensive to fly here or to get here. So the actual type of people that are coming here are usually people who have got more money, or they're fortunate that they've done that. So people can kind of judge other people from different countries in a strange manner just through bad incidents. And I think it's quite very narrow-minded or tunnel-visioned when people are like, I don't like people from this country, where I'm like, well, remember, you might be from, as example, in Australia, there might be some people that'd be like, I don't like in Melbourne, might be like, I don't like people from Brisbane, or I don't like people from Perth, or things like that. And you're like, well, that's kind of silly.
It is silly, isn't it? But I think often the only way through it is if these people get to know enough people from the other countries or other places. And that's what I think traveling often does, is that you can meet more and more diverse people from different countries. You get to know them, and there'll be some kind of very broad brushstroke kind of stereotypes that, you know, are fairly harmless and do kind of ring true, like most Germans being fairly punctual, for example. But the rest of it, yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, you can't judge a whole country on a handful of people. It's exactly true. So it sounds to me like Tom's doing an excellent job of dispelling stereotypes by reminding people, you know, that there are X million people in country Y, so you shouldn't make these kind of assumptions about them. And I know I do the same. I certainly always say those kinds of things to my son if I ever hear him mentioning some kind of negative stereotype that he's heard. So maybe Tom and I can save the world. We'll have a go. I actually was reminded when Tom and I chatted that about just over 20 years ago now, I was backpacking around Eastern Australia with my boyfriend at the time. And so we would have been in our early 20s. And we stayed at a youth hostel in Canberra. And I still remember being so surprised because the staff told us, oh, we actually don't usually let Australians stay. This is in Australia, in the Australian capital. They didn't like to have Australian guests stay at the youth hostel because they always partied so hard. There was too much alcohol involved and they were just difficult guests to have. So that was pretty embarrassing, and I guess it's a reflection on perhaps I looked very staid and boring that they told us, yes, they did have a room for us. So who knows? But I did really find that was a bit sad that in our own country they didn't want Australians there. Anyway, my final guest today is Dianne Bortoletto of Travelletto. And we start off talking about the stereotype of an Australian and then take our chat a little bit further into how we can broaden our views on stereotypes and life, I guess.
What do you think the rest of the world holds as a stereotype of an Australian?
Yeah, g'day, mate. Like someone that speaks like that all the time, or someone that's in thongs. I think someone that's quite laid back, a relaxed type person that's a little bit quite unsophisticated.
Yes.
That's what I think the Australian stereotype is to people overseas.
Yeah, no, that's what I think it is too. Something very similar to that, and somewhat right, but not always.
No, not always. And I think Australians are like Americans. I was saying before, Australians who have travelled, anybody who has travelled, their views are broader and I think often more rounded than those that have never left their own country. You know, when you haven't been, like we were talking about, if you haven't been pushed out of your comfort zone, you also get a greater understanding for people and their situations and how they grow up, and a lot more empathy for that as well, particularly when you go to third world countries or cities that just might not be as functional as perhaps where we're from. You can appreciate that life can be really hard for some people, and that's why they are the way they are. And yeah, so if you've never left, then you haven't experienced that, and views can sometimes be a bit narrow.
But that's right, if you've got nothing to compare it to, I guess. And actual physical experience beats decades of watching TV or reading books. Just being there makes such a difference.
I know. And how interesting is it when you're talking to somebody that's travelled a lot and then you talk to somebody that's never travelled, and after sort of superficial weather and, you know, like general life, what do? You got kids and this and that. And then, yeah, it's like, well, some people can be really, really, really boring, you know, like the people that hold centre court at a dinner party are those that have travelled, that have got lots of stories to tell.
Yeah, that is very often the case. I met a lovely lady at a parent at a birthday party a year or two ago, and, you know, she seemed very pleasant, and we had a, you know, quick chat, and I said I was a travel blogger, and of course she didn't really know what that meant, because lots of people don't. That's okay. But then she confessed that she'd never been outside of Australia and that she didn't even really want to go, which is, like, it's one thing to not have the opportunity to go, but to not want to go is something that just baffles me, because I just...
What do you mean?
Well, yes, exactly. What do you mean? What do you mean you don't want to go outside Australia? There's all these other amazing places. How can you not want to go? And she was really pleasant and lovely, but I just find it, what do you talk about then? So...
Yeah, I'm with you. You know, a girl I used to know ended up marrying a guy who said, I have no desire to go to London or Rome or anywhere like that. He hadn't left Australia either. And I'm like, why? And he said, it's just a big, busy, smoky city as far as I'm concerned. And I just thought, oh my God. And I just had to turn and go find someone else to talk to, because I can't rebut. There's no point even putting up an argument, because you're so set in your mind about what other places are like, and you've got no idea, and clearly you're wrong. But
well, yes,
to me, it just wasn't. It just wasn't even worth my breath to go, hang on a minute, and try and challenge him on it. I just couldn't be bothered. It was like, I'm going to go to the bar and get another drink. See ya, you know, and off I went.
Exactly, I totally understand.
So I think the message is pretty clear. Di and I have decided we just have to make sure everybody travels heaps, and stereotypes will be a thing of the past. Simple, isn't it? It's funny actually to think more about Australian stereotypes. I don't know if you know. If you're Australian, you'll know it, and if you're not, you may not. But one of my favourite movies of all time is a little Australian film called The Castle. I looked it up. It's actually from 1997, which sort of makes me feel a little bit old. But anyway, it's a movie about a typical Australian family, and I think it shows what we like to think is the stereotypical Australian in a really lovely, compassionate kind of light. Actually, it's funny, as I looked it up, it's described on the first page of Google as a cult film. I'm like, oh, it's an interesting kind of categorization for it. I think really it should be just a comedy. But if you do get to watch The Castle, then enjoy it. It's probably has some sort of lost in translation moments with our quirky Australian sense of humour. But it'll give you an idea of what we like to think good Australians are like. That's one way to think about Australian stereotypes. We are, to answer the question of the title, definitely not all tall and tanned. We're not typically very short, but not super, super tall. And tanned, well, that's a bit of a problem because we have these terribly high skin cancer rates, so we're all told to stay out of the sun as much as we possibly can. Some of us are tanned. I'm not. It's the end of winter and it's getting a bit, my skin's getting a bit pale, but summer will soon fix that up. Actually, speaking of Australian stereotypes, I actually had to record this section of the podcast twice. When I began last time, there was these terribly loud noises, and it was actually my neighbour who had started up the motor of his boat because summer is finally, we hope, coming. And being a typical Australian, he has a boat which he takes out to go fishing. Very Australian thing to do, and we live not too far from the coast here. So he decided that Sunday morning, as I'm recording this, was a great time to start cleaning up his boat's motor, ready for the summer season. So this is take 2, and all I can hear is the crows, which is a much better noise than the sound of his very loud boat's motor. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed episode 27 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. And if you're Australian, I'm keen to hear what you think about our stereotypes. Do you agree or disagree with what everyone said here today? And if you're not Australian, I'm curious if you've heard anything else about Australians or what kind of Australians you've met on your travels around the world. You can let me know on Facebook. Just look up Not a Ballerina on Facebook, or over on Twitter, you'll find me at Amanda Kendall. And you can use the Thoughtful Travel Pod hashtag on Twitter so that we can keep track of everyone's conversations. And finally, I need to give some great shout outs to my wonderful, wonderful guests. So first up today, we had Jeremy and Katie Kloberdanz of The Life Bohemian. They have the website at thelifebohemian.com. They also have the Life Bohemian podcast. It's well worth a listen, if nothing else, just for the very cool theme song. They have like a custom written The Life Bohemian theme song. And every time I hear it, it's stuck in my head and I try and wonder, could there be a Thoughtful Travel podcast theme song? Obviously, I can't even say it properly, so I wouldn't be the one to sing it. But anyway, have a listen to them. They've still in Europe, recently been through Croatia, Slovenia, and I think as I record this, they're in Austria. After that, we spoke with Tom Parson of the Lego Backpacker, and the best place to find him is on Instagram. He's the Lego Backpacker on Instagram. And well, you won't find him, but you'll find his Lego figures in all sorts of places around the world. And last but definitely not least, my lovely, lovely friend Dianne Bortoletto of Travelletto. We've recently come back from another trip together to the Gold Coast. We get to see, we live in the same city, but we get to see each other more when we go to conferences. So you can find her at travelletto.com. That's got 2 L's and 2 T's. Also in the show notes, I'm going to drop a link to episode 18 when we talk about Australians behaving badly in Japan, which I mentioned earlier on in this episode. And you can find that at notaballerina.com/18 if you want to have a listen to that. And also Jeremy and Katie have sent me some links to some of the Outback Steakhouse TV ads which they mentioned in our chat. So all of these details and more will be in the show notes. And for this episode, you'll find the show notes at notaballerina.com/27. And finally, please give me a lovely surprise by leaving a rating or a review on iTunes. Every one of those helps the Thoughtful Travel podcast be broadcast to more and more people. And of course, that really makes my day. Thanks a lot. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, Podcast.